Let's look at functions. So true or false, if a function contains a statement that changes a value parameter, only the copy of the argument is 10, not the original. So we're passing the parameter by value. Is that true or false? That is true. So how do we declare a function? We declare a function with a prototype. Where does the prototype goes? They can either go above main, or you can use an include file, put a prototype on include file, then it includes that on your program. What is the scope of a local identifier and a local variable when you created that? The scope of that is defined to the end of the block in which it was declared. So you declare on the beginning of your program and you can use up to the end of the program. True or false? The scope of a value parameter is identical of the scope of a local variable declared on the outermost block of a functional body. So it's asking if a parameter of a function that you're passing and a variable that you declare within that function right on the beginning of the function has the same scope, meaning they will exist at the same time, which is true. True or false? In C++, corresponding arguments from the calling function and the parameters from the calling function must have the same name. It means, do you need to use the same name on the main program when it's calling a function and the same name for that parameter in the function? That is false, right? We can have any name. The only thing that's correlated is the location. So the first parameter that you pass to the function will be given to the same argument to the function. When do you use a void function? There's two times we will do that. The first one is when there's nothing to return, so we don't need to return anything, we'll make that void. Or when we need to return multiple values for that function, so we make that void and pass by reference the parameters that we're going to use for return. So how do we return multiple values from a function? Yeah, we just talked about that by passing by reference. What is a side effect? It's an effect associated with passing some parameters by reference. When a variable is passed by reference and is inadvertently changed by the function being called. So the function modified the variable when we're not supposed to, and we know when we pass by reference, we link that with the original variable on the main program or on the function that we're calling it. So you were making changes where we're not supposed to have changes. How can we avoid side effect? If we need to pass by reference, we can make as a constant reference. Of course, we also pass by value because we're making a copy. Therefore, there wouldn't be side effect there because you don't link those two sides. Parameter passed by reference use if the parameter has the following data flow. So let's go through that. One way into the function. Now, if it's just one way into the function, we won't use by reference, we'll just pass by value. One way out of the function, yes. Two ways in and out of the function, yes, it's true. So the best answers here is B and C. True or false? When in passing by value, data flow is one way into the function. Well, we just talked about that too, right? What type of arguments can be sent from the calling function when passing by reference? So we're passing by reference. So when we pass something by reference, we effectively pass the address on memory where that element is, which has to be a variable to get an address in memory that can be changed. So it can only be a variable. So let's continue looking at functions here. What type of arguments can be sent from the calling function when passing by value? Meaning, if I pass by value, I'm going to make a copy of that value to give to the function. So anything can be passed. So I can pass variables, constants, expression, literals, anything would be acceptable. Okay, true or false? All functions should have a return statement. Well, if the function is void, it doesn't have a return statement, so this is false. If a module is supposed to compute and return the average of 5 numbers, which is the more appropriate, a value return function or a void function? So the function is doing some computation returning one value. So in that case, a value returning function would be the best choice. True or false? Functions must have a return data type. That is true, right? Even if we don't have something to return, we make that function void. What should be the return data type for the main on your program? So it's defined, the main would be an int. So we usually, if everything goes well, we do a return 0 at the end of the program. What's the advantage of using functions? So we talk a lot about that concept. So we use functions to support reusability, so we can reuse the function over and over. We can make the code more readable, we simplify, we don't have so many repetitions on the code, for instance, if you need to reuse that. Makes it easier to test. We discuss about breaking in part and do testing separate. It keeps the code more organized. So there's a lot of advantage for functions for us to use. Let's continue talking about functions here. What are the 3 steps in the function process? So what we need to do to be able to utilize functions. The first thing we do is declare a function. Then once we declare, we need to define the function. So we actually implement that function. And then of course we can use the function. So where we place those steps above. So where do we declare the function? So the function is declared using a prototype. We discussed about that before. We'll do that above main. Or we can also put in a header file and include that whenever we are calling the header file, whatever we're calling that function. So where we define the function is defined either below main on the same source code file, or we have a separate source code file. And of course we can use the function anywhere we want, within anybody within the program. Let's declare a function that is passing 2 integers, represents a sum and a count of those numbers, and then return an average. So we're going to return an average. Average is a float, and then we're passing 2 integers. So we also have to find a name for this function. So our prototype will be float, that's a return value. Average ints, something that indicates that I'm taking average of integers, and then 2 integers, the sum and the count. Now we're going to declare a function that returns a sum and an average of an integer array. So what we're doing here is we need to return 2 parameters. Therefore, we can use a normal return value function because they only allow 1 parameter. The technique there is to make that function void and then passing those sum and average by reference, so I can use that as a return type. And in this function, we're also using an array that we're going to be used to sum all the elements and calculate the average. So in order to do that, what I do is make it a void, calc sum and av. I'll pass the array, but I'm passing the array just for read, so I make that as a constant reference, and also pass the size of the array as a constant. And then you can see there I have the 2 parameters as by reference. We use that little address operator, the %, marker there. True or false? You can only have 1 return statement in a function. That is not true. That's false. We can have multiple. We just have to be careful when we use that, because sometimes get confused and it's not easy potentially to troubleshoot that. So very careful as you use multiple return statements. What is the advantage of passing by value? So passing by value allow us to not having side effects. So there's no accidental change that we do on the argument. It's also simple implementation. And we can also pass anything because we're going to get a copy. So we can pass variables, expression, literal constants, and so on. So let's continue here. What is the disadvantage of passing by value? So there's a few things we discussed before. The first one was the overhead. So large variables, they need to have to be copied. We need to define a space in memory to put that value, so it takes some time. So the value of the variable has to be copied, initialized. Large variables, time and space could be a penalty issue there. When we pass by reference, what we're passing to the calling function. So when we're passing by reference, we're not making a copy. So we're passing just the address, right, of the variable. What is the disadvantage of passing by reference? There's a few things we discussed. The first one is the side effect. The second one is hard to tell if the parameters being passed is used for input and output or for both. So that's why it's important to well document a function as far as the prototype, so you can see what you're using that for. And then the last one here is that we can only pass variables. Since we're passing the address, we can use expressions or constants or anything else. So how do we pass a function, a parameter by reference? Do you remember? We just talked about that on the previous slide. We use the address operator, which is that little %, after the data type before we have the name of the parameter.